Welcome to the Secret Agenda YouTube channel. The war in Ukraine deeply affects the entire international community, and the reactions to the Russian president continue to grow. Putin, who has paralyzed the lives of civilians in Ukraine and Russia, with more and more severe attacks every day in the war, which is almost in its 9th month, has also started to make serious threats to increase the level of these attacks. While NATO and NATO ally countries react very harshly to these threats, reactions continue to rise from within Russia itself. Russian anti-war protesters and partisans began to impede the activities of the Russian army. In the latest report, Russian anti-war vigilantes bombarded the main railway route to Belarus. This is not the first action by the Russian partisans. We must remember the assassination attempts on the Russian staff in the past months. At the same time, Russian partisans openly threatened Putin with a text they published. However, all of these actions were generally aimed at the political leg of Russia. The last action, on the other hand, has a much greater meaning as it's aimed directly at the Russian army. British intelligence officials said in a statement that the Russian anti-war group bombed an important railway line used to deploy troops and weapons to the war in Ukraine. A spokesperson for the UK Ministry of Defence said, an explosive device damaged the railway near the village of Novozybkovo. The UK's Ministry of Defence has announced that for its key Kremlin ally, with its longtime troops and warfighting missiles, this line is the main rail link between Russia and southern Belarus. According to the aforementioned British intelligence report, the Russian military primarily relies on rail transport to deploy forces in Ukraine. But securing a system with a network stretching more than 22,500 miles against physical threats is extremely difficult. The UK government ministry announced that the Russian anti-war Stop Wagons group claimed responsibility for the incident. A spokesperson for the UK government department said this is part of a broader trend of oppositional offensive against railways in both Russia and Belarus. The Russian anti-war group bragged about this sabotage, stating that the main route had been completely relayed. After this incident, Russian President Vladimir Putin realized much better that he was not only at war with Ukraine. It seems impossible for Putin to prevent this fire of rebellion in Russia, as his attacks have hit not only Ukraine but also the conscience of the people. A Russian businessman in exile recently called on the Russian people to sabotage Putin's war. While critics say mass opposition is unlikely, Mikhail Khodorkovsky argues that armed resistance may play a role. Exiled Russian businessman Mikhail Khodorkovsky urged Russians still at home to unleash a wave of sabotage against state structures in an attempt to derail Vladimir Putin's war in Ukraine and destabilize his government. Khodorkovsky, who spent 10 years in prison between 2003 and 2013 and now lives in London, declared that Putin's invasion completely changed the agenda of Russia's political opposition and claimed that armed resistance may play a role at some point in the future. Khodorkovsky said, "We need to explain to people what they can do, persuade them to do it, and also help people if they get into a dangerous situation." Khodorkovsky noted that potential actions must depend on each person's risk tolerance and can range from graffitiing anti-war graffiti on the streets to sabotaging war-related rail deliveries or burning conscription offices. Criticizing the murder of Daria Dugina, the daughter of a Russian imperialist ideologue, Khodorkovsky said, "But we are very openly opposed to terrorist methods that harm unarmed people." In 2003, Khodorkovsky was arrested on widely viewed as political charges after he publicly criticized the government's corruption in a meeting with Putin and promised to finance opposition parties. His arrest was seen as one of the first milestones in Putin's gradual tightening of the screws over the past 2 decades. Khodorkovsky stated that sooner or later, the Putin regime will fall. Khodorkovsky hopes that one of the key elements of this will be Ukraine's victory in the war. According to Khodorkovsky, Russia then must be reformed as a loose parliamentary federation. Khodorkovsky claimed that there is a path to this outcome that does not involve bloodshed, but it's unlikely. Khodorkovsky also explained that the most important thing for the West is not to completely wipe out Russia, so that the moment of crisis has come and the chances of post-Putin Russia to become liberal and pro-Western will increase. Khodorkovsky's statements are remarkable, and most of them really seem to have been said after the region's heartbeat was weighed. But the Kremlin has to continue its propaganda. Even if the Kremlin administration loses in the war, it tries to justify its attacks by covering it up somehow. Blinded by its own propaganda, Russia was not ready for defeat in the war against Ukraine, so it had to hastily correct its own rhetoric. That's why Russia denies the successes of the Ukrainian army in the counterattack, continues to focus on the alleged shortcomings of the Ukrainian defense system, and changes in the tactics of special military operations, as always, ensure that everything is secured. The Center for Combating Disinformation and Information Security has collected several examples of how Kremlin propaganda has adjusted the playbooks amid the military defeats its armies have suffered in the war against Ukraine. With Ukraine swiftly liberating its cities and towns, Russian propagandists launched a massive campaign of excuses and explanations for local audiences. If Russia called the liberation of Snake Island from Russian occupation a gesture of goodwill, then the loss of Balaklia, Izium, and Kupiansk was justified by the decision to carry out an operation to fold and organize the regrouping and transfer of the blind. Russian Defense Chief Sergei Shoigu announced a deliberate slowdown in the pace of the Russian offensive to save the lives of the civilian population. Similarly, in March, he described the withdrawal of Russian troops from the Kiev and Chernihiv regions as a drastic reduction in military activity to increase mutual trust. However, in both cases, the real reason for the withdrawal was the sustained serious casualties in action and the failure to provide appropriate supplies. On October 10th, after the massive Russian missile attacks targeting Ukraine, Russian propaganda was revived. It was then that the propagandists demanded a new phase of the dissolution of Ukraine, with repeated and regular calls for strikes. They see critical infrastructure as their main goal. According to the propagandists, all this is to deprive Ukraine of comfort because Ukraine has adapted to the current war, thanks to Western support. They want this harmony to be interrupted, because it's known that if this course continues, Russia will not be able to win. The Russian provocateurs are also aware of this, so they support the continuation of the attacks. With similar narratives, Russian propaganda tries to continue to focus on the shortcomings of Ukraine's defense system to justify its own weakness. This narrative was particularly active during the major Russian missile attacks on Ukraine. In their view, Belarus is intensely preparing for an attack on Ukraine, and Russian propaganda will play a greater role, creating panic and helping to find fictitious provocations on behalf of other states, including Ukraine. With the latest developments, the Kremlin media has shifted Ukraine from the country of the Nazis and fascists to the terrorist state. Seeing that it's come to the end of the road, the Kremlin thinks that if it calls Ukraine a terrorist state, its attacks will have a legitimate basis. Putin, who has built this policy in his mind from the very beginning, does not hesitate to put his plans into action when the time comes. But even though the Russian leader, who has nowhere to run, tries to use the Russian media for these plans, he is getting closer to the sad end with every step he takes. Please do not forget to subscribe to our channel and turn on notifications in order to be informed about new videos. Thank you for watching us.